Mr Speaker, well, the Green Party is pleased to add our voice in support to the others that have expressed that cross-party support for this legislation in the House this afternoon. It is good to see a piece of very significant legislation like this proceed with such a high degree of support across the House. And it's very timely, Mr Speaker, because this bill is passing through Parliament at a time when heritage issues probably have never been higher in the public consciousness, particularly, of course, following the devastating Christchurch earthquakes, which, as the Minister pointed out, hadn't yet taken place when the bill was first contemplated, but have certainly provided the backdrop for much of the discussion, particularly about built heritage that has taken place with this bill. And also, of course, legislation that straddles the very fine line between heritage protection and the need for earthquake strengthening is also currently before the House. So these issues are very current and of great concern in the public consciousness. And in New Zealand, we have a unique heritage. Our built heritage and indeed many of our other historic sites are a very vital and important part of our national identity. And sadly, we often only perceive just how important they are when they have been lost to us, as we have seen in the case with so many buildings in Christchurch. What makes us who we are and what identifies us as New Zealanders or as Cantabrians or as people belonging to a particular place or site is often inextricably tied up with buildings, with heritage sites, with archaeological sites, and their preservation is very important. So heritage issues obviously stir the passions of many New Zealanders because they're controversial issues. Witness the strength of debate about the future of the Christchurch Cathedral, for example, in Christchurch. And so it's important that we get the legislative framework for having these debates right. And I think we're pretty close with this bill. Just as our built heritage is an important part of our national identity, so of course has been the iconic Historic Places Trust, which has been a very important membership-based advocacy organisation for many, many years. And I think every member of this House and many members of the public will have positive associations with their local Historic Places Trust organisation, largely thanks to the dedicated efforts of passionate volunteers at the branch level. Many buildings have been preserved, many sites have been saved, and many iconic sites have been brought to the public attention and promoted to be enjoyed by members of the public as a result of the work of the branch committees of the Historic Places Trust. So it is with some sadness, and it was with some degree of misgiving when this bill first came into the House, that we witness with this passage the disestablishment of branch committees of the Historic Places Trust. We understand, of course, that this change has not been uncontroversial, particularly amongst local members of branch committees around the country, and the Select Committee heard from a number of these people, concerned that their hard work in the past may not be sufficiently recognised under the new model, or that their voices and advocacy may go unheard in future. And that is a real concern. However, we do acknowledge that under the current soon-to-be-passed model, there was a mismatch between having the Historic Places Trust as a Crown entity and having a branch membership structure at the local level. So there is some logic in the changes that this bill makes. But I think it's going to be very, very important to keep a close eye and to ensure that local membership of heritage advocacy committees under the new model will continue, and that these groups will be able to focus very strongly on their advocacy role. The Minister has indicated he hopes that will happen as well. Of course, for them to be able to do that, they do need to have the right level of support, and we're pleased to see that some transitional financial support has been made available to local organisations, and the Green Party argued at the Select Committee, along with our colleagues, I think, in the Labour Party, that we would have liked that support to have been greater, and we do think it's a shame that it's not. But we will watch this area closely, and I would like to echo the comments of my colleague Grant Robertson, who's just spoken about the importance of advocacy, because while the Minister has indicated he thinks that the new heritage advocacy committees at local level will be able to focus their efforts on advocacy, and rightly so, there is still an important role, heritage advocacy role, that the new Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga organisation can and should fill. And we, of course, have seen a parallel with the Department of Conservation, which also has an advocacy role as a government department, which in the past has exercised that advocacy role completely independently and free of any political interference. We're concerned in the Green Party, and I know many others are, that independent advocacy role of the Department of Conservation has been eroded somewhat recently, and the Ruataniwha Dam is a good example. So we think it's going to be very important that although we still have heritage advocacy committees at the branch level to do advocacy, shouldn't be siloed just to those groups. If there is a significant heritage issue which Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga should be advocating on, then they will and should do that in future, and the Green Party will certainly be watching very closely to ensure that that happens. Similarly, we think it's very important that while the interest of landowners obviously need to be considered very carefully in any heritage decisions, they also need to be considered alongside the interests of others and alongside the interests of heritage. That greater weight is not given to landowners' interests over the interests of other stakeholders. Now, one of the other things that makes our heritage in New Zealand so unique, of course, is our tangata whenua, and it was always going to be vital to ensure that tangata whenua and mana whenua are adequately involved in heritage decisions on land in their rohi and indeed over historic sites that relate to Māori history. So we were pleased to see the Select Committee recommendation to widen the range of parties that Heritage New Zealand must work with to include tangata whenua as well as government agencies. And one of the major areas of change in the bill, of course, is around new archaeological authorities for the exploration of the potential new heritage site. And I'd like to join others in acknowledging the work of my colleague Catherine Delahunty for her constructive work with the Minister to ensure that when a new architect is appointed to work on a site of significance to Māori, that mana whenua have a say in that appointment. That is a very important and significant change which was made in the Minister's SOP during the committee stages of this bill, and we're very pleased to see that change made and very pleased that the Minister was able to work constructively with our colleague Catherine Delahunty to make that change. It will make a big difference for many mana whenua who are dealing with archaeological sites in their rohi. The other major new initiative of this bill, of course, is the creation of a national register of historic sites. And that is a new and potentially very useful tool for people to engage with our history and to understand and visit, perhaps if they want to, sites that are collected and published on that list. I think there was a great deal of concern by a number of submitters about the idea of limiting that number of sites on that list to only 50. It was quite an arbitrary number and unnecessarily prescriptive when we have such a rich vein of heritage in our country. So I was pleased to see that was abandoned, and now there won't be a limit to the number of sites that can be declared to be on the National Register of Historically Significant Sites, but that each site will be considered on its merits. That was a sensible change. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we have in the Green Party had some concerns about the role of branch committees and local membership in heritage advocacy, about the importance of a Crown entity continuing to exercise some advocacy over heritage in the future, about alignment with the RMA, which I haven't spoken a great deal about, but which will also be very important, and about the ability for mana whenua and tangata whenua to have their concerns and their sites of significance rightly taken into account in heritage decisions. Some of those concerns remain for us. We're not 100% comfortable with every aspect of this bill, but we think by and large the SOPs, the select committee's constructive deliberations have got it right, and we're pleased to be able to support this bill. And I'd like to conclude, Mr. Speaker, with a whakatauki, which seems appropriate, and that is puritia ngā taonga tuku ihu I a ngā tupuna hei tiki huia mā ngā uri whakatupu a Aotearoa, and translated that means keep the treasures handed down by the ancestors as an adornment for the descendants yet to be born in New Zealand. Seems an appropriate sentiment on which to conclude, Mr. Speaker.
I call Jackie Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I acknowledge some of the